Hey, welcome to another Bible study here at Influence Church. We are in the book of Exodus, and if you've missed any of our previous studies, you can go straight to our YouTube channel. You can click the videos tabs, and you can rewatch any of those studies that we've completed thus far. In our last study, we covered a very important topic. We touched on some Bible prophecy, speaking about the third temple that has to be built in Jerusalem and how that is related to the return of Jesus Christ. So if you missed that study, you can definitely take a look at it. And before that, we covered the tabernacle of Moses and all the items that was found in the tabernacle of Moses. So far, the book of Exodus has been packed with a lot of great information. Today is no different. We're going to be tackling a very important topic, and the title of our Bible study today is Should Christians Keep the Sabbath, right? Should Christians keep the Sabbath? Now, in the Old Testament, the Sabbath was one of the 10 commandments, and it was strictly upheld in the Old Testament, and into the time of Jesus by the religious leaders, it was held in high esteem. Even till this day, in Jewish customs, the Sabbath is honored, and as well in some denominations of Christianity, such as Seventh-day Adventists, the Sabbath day is honored. So should Christians celebrate the Sabbath? What does the Bible have to say about the Sabbath, and if Christians should honor the Sabbath? So we're going to jump into our presentation for today. Grab your Bible to follow along and grab a notepad. You're definitely going to want to take some notes today, all right? And if you have not done it as yet, click that share button and click that subscribe button. Okay, so we're getting into our study, and the title, as I said, is Should Christians Keep the Sabbath? And I want to start from Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 18. This is where Moses has given the law to honor the Sabbath, or to keep the Sabbath. And it says, "And the Lord spake to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people." So you'd actually be exiled from the Jewish community if you were to break the Sabbath by doing work on the Sabbath. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Now, I want you to understand how serious the consequences for breaking the Sabbath was in the Old Testament under the Mosaic law, right? They had to obey the Sabbath or they will be put to death. It continues to tell us, "Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant." So the children of Israel ought to keep the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It does not give an expiration date for the Sabbath. It says it is forever. Right? It is a sign between me, this is God, and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And when he made an end of speaking with him on the Mount Sinai, so when God finished speaking with Moses, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God, right? And these are the 10 commandments. So one of them is to obey and to honor the Sabbath. Now, there's a lot of debate on what day the Sabbath is. Is the Sabbath the Sunday or is it the Saturday? And by definition, the Sabbath, or in Hebrew, the Shabbat or Shavat, is a day of holiness and rest observed by Jews from sunset on Friday to nightfall the following day. So the Sabbath is the Saturday. There's no debate there. The Sabbath is certainly not the Sunday. As a matter of fact, in later Jewish customs, it is believed under some denominations of Christianity that worship on the Sunday, forsaking the Sabbath, the Saturday, and worshiping God on the Sunday, as the early church would have done because they honored the resurrection of Jesus Christ on the Sunday. In some denominations of Christianity, it is believed that worshiping God on a Sunday is actually the mark of the beast. It's believed that worship unto another god happens on that Sunday, and that is actually worship unto the Antichrist, right? Shifting from the day of the Sabbath, the Sunday, onto Saturday, onto the day of Sunday worship, right? And that's a whole other teaching when it comes to why there is this belief that Sunday worship is actually a mark of the beast, all right? So the Saturday is the Sabbath, right? The Saturday is the Sabbath, and it's from 6 p.m. or sunset on the Friday till nightfall, so sunset again the following day, the Saturday. So no work was to be done for that 24-hour period. The time division follows the biblical story of creation, and it comes from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5, where it says, and there was evening and there was morning, and it was one day, right? So that is where we get this timing of the seventh day, which is the day that God rested, the Sabbath. So we see in the Old Testament that the Sabbath was law. It must have been followed. What does this mean now for Christians? What does this mean under the new covenant? Now, we must remember that while it was a perpetual covenant for the children of Israel, it speaks of the Mosaic covenant, it speaks of the old covenant under the law. Now, when Jesus came, Jesus was the fulfillment of the law, and Jesus established a new covenant with his people, both with the Jews and with the Gentiles, that through his blood, through the sacrifice of the cross, that there is a new covenant where we move from under the law to we move to the covenant of grace, where we move from under the stone tablets to where our heart becomes that place where the Spirit of God dwells in. And he actually, instead of writing on physical tablets with his finger, his law, he has now written his law on our hearts through the Holy Spirit living inside of us, the new covenant. So what does this mean now when it comes to Jesus and the Sabbath? Well, I want us to examine some examples from the New Testament of how Jesus handled the Sabbath. Now, this information might be a little bit disturbing if you celebrate the Sabbath, or if you had a preconception that Jesus honored the Sabbath, because we're actually going to see that Jesus actually broke the Sabbath, while to some extent he still honored the Sabbath. Now, I know what you're saying, right? Am I confused? How could he break the Sabbath and still honor the Sabbath? Well, we must understand that the Jews, like we would have seen under the Sadducees and the Pharisees, these Jewish religious leaders, they added a lot of additional laws to the Mosaic law, right? We did cover the 630 mitzvot in our previous studies in the book of Exodus, speaking about all the additional laws that were added on as well by the religious leaders. What they also did was they added on a lot of additional laws to the Sabbath that was not the original intent of God when it comes to rest. They misunderstood the meaning of the Sabbath, making it more religious than what it was meant to be when it comes to rest and relationship with God. So Jesus actually breaks the religious construct of what they made the Sabbath into, while still honoring God's original intent for the Sabbath. And when we examine what Jesus did, it will help us to understand now as Christians what is God's intent for us under the new covenant when it comes to the Sabbath, right? So the first example I want us to look at is from John chapter 5, verse 8 to 10, right? And it says, Jesus said to him, now there is a man, he is lame from birth, and he's sitting at the gate Bethesda. Jesus says to him, get up, take up your bed and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, the healing miracle that Jesus did was something that would have not been done on a Sabbath, right? So under the religious rule, they considered that even performing miracles, doing good, should not even be done on the Sabbath. You should do absolutely nothing. Jesus now is saying the heart of God is that you should always do good, right? You should always do good, perform miracles, right? So he's performing a miracle on the Sabbath, and he also goes a step further to not just perform a miracle, but he gives the man some work to do, right? In performing the miracle, he tells this guy to take up his bed and walk. Now, Jesus performed miracles in many different ways. When we examine this passage, part of the healing process or the miracle is actually this man getting up and taking up his bed and walk, that act of faith. Jesus could have done this miracle in different ways. He did not have to tell this man to take up his bed and walk, but he knew that the Pharisees and the religious rulers of that time were looking on. They were looking for something to accuse him of, and they were looking to see if he would break the Sabbath. This is kind of radical of Jesus, because he knows they want to see if he'll break the Sabbath, and still he does something that in their eyes, under the religious mindset that they have, will be perceived as breaking the Sabbath, right? So he continues to say, now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed and walk. And we're just going to jump a little bit to the end of this passage in verse 18 of John chapter 5. It says, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. So they wanted to kill Jesus because he broke the Sabbath. It says, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, so he broke the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, this verse alone debunks all the arguments that Jesus is not equal to God, and that Jesus is a created being, or that Jesus is of a different ranking to God, or he's a great prophet. This verse here shows us that the reason he was murdered by the Jewish community is because they understood that Jesus claimed to be equal with God and to be God, part of the Trinity. And if you don't understand the topic of the Trinity, we did cover that in one of our previous Bible studies. So definitely check out that explanation of the Trinity. It will help you to understand this concept of the Trinity and how God exists as a triune being. So it was clear in the Jewish community that Jesus claimed to be God. This is why they wanted to kill him. He broke the Sabbath and he claimed to be equal with God. Why did Jesus break the Sabbath? I want to give you another example, right, of Jesus and the Sabbath, right? Mark chapter 2, verse 23 to 28. It says, now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of the grain. And the Pharisees said, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples are going through someone else's field, not their field, and they're picking the grain, they're rubbing it, and they're opening it, and they're eating from what is on the inside. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Isn't that stealing as well? Well, it's not, because under the Jewish law, you were allowed to take from someone else's field just a handful. So you're allowed to take just what you can take in your hand. You're allowed to eat that. You're not allowed to plow that person's field to actually harvest. That would be stealing, right? If you were to take a sickle and try to harvest that person's field, it would be stealing. But if you're just passing through, you're hungry, you could just take some and you can eat, right? It was actually, under Jewish law, it was actually permitted that, or it was actually a custom that the owners of a field would not harvest the wheat surrounding the field, so that those that were less fortunate, those that were poor and did not have something to eat, could actually come and take the grains that were still growing around the field that weren't harvested, and they can eat of it. They can take of the handfuls and eat of it, right? But it would be stealing if someone would actually come and start harvesting it to sell it back. That would be stealing, right? So what Jesus and his disciples was doing was permitted under the Jewish law. So they weren't stealing, but they were working on the Sabbath. But they weren't really working, because working would be actually harvesting your field. They were just getting something to eat, right? Anyhow, so under the religious mentality, the Pharisees saw it as them breaking the Sabbath. They were working on the Sabbath. And here's what happens, right? The Pharisees said, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, Jesus said, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how they went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar and the high priest, and they ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest. Now, remember, 2 studies ago, we covered all the items that were found in the temple, and one of them was 12 loaves of bread. This is the showbread, and these 12 loaves of bread represented each one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the high priest would actually eat this bread and drink the wine as a form of communion from the Old Testament, and this communion now was fulfilled with what Jesus did, his body and his blood shed on the cross for us, right? So David went in when he and his men was hungry, and they actually ate the bread that was supposed to be for the priest alone, right? Which is not lawful to eat except for the priest. And he also gave some of those to who were with him. Now, David was not a priest, right? He was king of Israel, but he was not a priest. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I want you to understand something here, right? When we read from Exodus chapter 31, it says that God said to the children of Israel that it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. That is what he said to them. It is a sign for me and the children of Israel forever. He's speaking about the Sabbath, right? And it even says in the previous verses in Exodus chapter 31 that it is a sign again for me and you through your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. So the promise of the Sabbath is between God and man. Look at what Jesus says now. Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man. That's correct. It's a promise between God and man, not man for the Sabbath. And why he's saying it like this is he's trying to help them understand that the Sabbath was there for them to find a place of rest and to have that space where they rest in God, they communicate with God, not for them instead to be worshiping the Sabbath, but worshiping God on that day. And they had come to a place through religion where they were worshiping the Sabbath. But look at what he says to the end of this verse. He says, therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now, he's speaking about himself, and he's saying that he is Lord of the Sabbath. What did God say in Exodus? He said that this shall be a covenant between me and you, me and the children of Israel. And he says that it is a covenant to show that God sanctifies them, that God is the one that has redeemed them. He is the one that is honoring them through the Sabbath. Here now, Jesus is saying he is Lord of the Sabbath. He is making a claim that he actually has that authority and that power over the Sabbath, because he is saying, again, like we just read, he is equal to God. He's saying that he is Lord of the Sabbath. I want you to understand that Jesus is making a statement, he is Lord of the Sabbath, that God established the Sabbath between him and mankind. Because when you understand that, you understand Jesus is equal to God, that Jesus is saying that he is Lord of the Sabbath, it's going to make sense now in how do we as Christians approach the Sabbath, right? And I just want to give you some additional references to how, again, Jesus broke the Sabbath, some other miracles that he performed on the Sabbath, and of course, he kept upsetting the Pharisees and the religious leaders of that time. So I want you to take note of these, and you can read it as well after our study today. So Mark chapter 3, verse 1 to 6, a man with a withered hand was healed. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 16, a man born blind was healed. Luke chapter 13, verse 10 to 17, a crippled woman was healed in a synagogue. Luke chapter 14, verse 1 to 6, a man with dropsy at a Pharisee's house was healed. And Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 28, a demon-possessed man in Capernaum were healed. All of these miracles were performed on the Sabbath. So what does that mean? Should you honor the Sabbath or should you not honor the Sabbath? Like I said, Jesus, while he broke the Sabbath under the religious mindset, he did honor it in terms of what God wanted out of the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath was meant for that space where we rest in God, where we understand the heart of God, which was for humanity to become whole. Now, coming from the old covenant now into the new covenant, into Jesus, if Jesus is a fulfillment of the law, if Jesus is the one that said he is Lord of the Sabbath, that means that in the fulfillment of the law that Jesus did, that when we accept Jesus as Lord of our life, when we are now under the new covenant of grace in Jesus Christ, where we're no longer under the law that is meant to, the law was there to guide us so that we could finally come to that place where we have relationship with Christ and have relationship with God through Christ. Jesus fulfilling that law means that those who have accepted Jesus, that under this new covenant of grace, that you are actually honoring the Sabbath in having relationship or resting in Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus would speak a lot about those who are weary, heavy laden. Come and find rest in me. We know that Christ is the one that we bring our burdens to, that we can lay it before him. And when it comes to understanding the Sabbath was meant for man to find that place where they find rest in God. When we come to Christ, we are now finding rest in God. So we're no longer under the law where we had to have this set aside day where we find that time to rest in God. But from accepting Jesus, we are immediately through relationship with God are able to rest in God at any point in time or continuously. So what does that really mean, right? And I'm just going to give you some additional verses from the New Testament that is kind of going to bring it into perspective, right? It says in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 to 17, so let no one judge you in food or in drink, in regards to festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So in the circumcision, in Sabbath, in the dietary plans, in terms of the food that you were not allowed to eat as a Jew. And we see Peter having a vision where God told him not to call anything that he has made clean, unclean. In the rituals, in terms of all the different celebrations that the Jews would have, in all these things, they are all meant to be a foreshadow of what Christ would fulfill through the cross. Circumcision being a covenant between Abraham and his lineage and God. Christ, his crucifixion being that new covenant, his blood being shed, that covenant between him, Jesus, God, and mankind. The rest of the Sabbath was fulfilled now in Jesus Christ. Jesus is the substance of that, where the Sabbath was meant to help us to rest in God. Now, through Jesus, we can find rest in God, right, as his creation. So I want you to understand what we're seeing here in the New Testament is that Christ now is the substance of all those rituals, those celebrations, those things under the Mosaic law that was meant to guide us to God. Christ now is the one that fulfills all of it. He's the substance of it. And in him now, all those things are fulfilled. So Paul is saying, let no one judge you in food or drink, in festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths, which are shadows of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So in the Old Testament, under the Mosaic law, these things were meant to shadow what Christ would one day do. Now he has done it, and we are now under this new covenant in Christ. So let me just answer the question now. Should Christians honor the Sabbath or keep the Sabbath this Saturday? Yes or no? My answer to that is yes or no. You can or you cannot, right? What we must understand is in keeping the Sabbath, the original intent was not for the religious mindset that the Pharisees made it into, but it was for that time where we rest in God. Taking one day where we just rest in God, where we rejuvenate as God would have rested on the seventh day. If you want to take a day, it can be Saturday, it can be any other day of the week, where you take a day to rest in God. That is extremely important. And I certainly advise that you do rest in God, all right? Physically rest as well as spiritually rest. So should you celebrate the Sabbath? Yes or no? You can if you want. You can honor this Saturday as the Sabbath and take that time and rest in God. Or you can take another day during the week and rest in God. But the important thing is you find time to rest, and you find time to turn to God and find that space where you rejuvenate spiritually in God. Too many people are burnt out in ministry. Too many people are burnt out in their careers and in all the things that they are doing to support their family. And because they're not finding rest in God, they are not being refueled spiritually, and they are finding themselves anxious. They're finding themselves depressed. They're finding themselves stressed out. They're finding themselves with health complications. Rest is important. The Sabbath was made for man. It was made for us to find that space of rest spiritually, physically, emotionally. This is what Christ offers us. So should you honor the Sabbath? Yeah, you can do it, or you don't have to do it as well. It is not breaking the law of God. It is not sinful. It's not a salvation issue if you don't honor the Sabbath. There are some teachings that teach that if you break the Sabbath, then you will not enter into heaven because you have gone against the principles of God. That is not true. When it comes to salvation, there's only one way of salvation, which is through Jesus Christ. No longer under our works, but we are under grace, the new covenant, right? We're not saved by works, but we're saved by grace. So if you're wondering if I'm talking craziness, let me just conclude with Romans chapter 14, verse 5 to 6, which makes it clear concerning you can celebrate the Sabbath on the Saturday. You don't have to either. It's not law anymore. You won't be exiled from heaven or from the Christian community if you don't celebrate the Sabbath. Celebrate it or not is your choice, right? Romans chapter 14, verse 5 to 6, it says, one person esteems one day above another, that's the Sabbath. Another esteems every day alike, right? That's those that do not keep the Sabbath. Every day is holy. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day, observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord. He who gives, for he gives God thanks. He who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat, and gives God thanks. So what is Paul saying here? Whether you observe the Sabbath or you don't observe the Sabbath, once your heart is in that place where you are doing it from a place of honoring God, all right, whether it's observing that Saturday as a Sabbath or not observing it, but still finding time to rest in God throughout the week, then you are convicted in your heart, convinced in your mind, and you are doing the right thing, right? So you're not doing it under a law per se, under a religious form like the Pharisees would have done. You're doing it unto God and honoring the Sabbath, that's fine. You're not doing honoring the Sabbath, but you're resting in God throughout the week, honoring Him throughout the week, that's fine as well. All right. So I hope that answers our question for today on should Christians keep the Sabbath? Yeah, you can. You don't need to as well. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the comments. I do hope that you were blessed by this study today. And if you missed any of our previous studies, like I said, you can watch it over on YouTube. And if you have not done it as yet, click that share button and click that subscribe button. Do enjoy the rest of your day if you're viewing this at day, or the rest of your night if you're viewing it at night. God bless you.